August 23, 1914, the Montcondet Canal, Belgium. The morning mist had barely lifted when Hauptmann Friedrich Schmidt of the German 18th Infantry Regiment raised his field glasses and studied the British positions across the canal. The young officer, a veteran of peacetime manoeuvres but untested in actual combat, allowed himself a confident smile. The British Expeditionary Force, that small professional army that Kaiser Wilhelm had dismissed as a contemptible little force, was dug in along the waterway. Schmidt's regiment, part of General Alexander von Kluck's First Army, outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. This would be over quickly. What Schmidt and the 160,000 German soldiers preparing to attack that morning could not have known was that they were about to encounter a weapon system that would redefine their understanding of rifle fire. In the trenches and hastily dug positions along the canal, 70,000 British soldiers waited with a rifle that most military experts of the day considered outdated, a compromised design that prioritized speed over precision. The Germans, armed with the technically superior Mauser Gewehr 98, believed their weapons represented the pinnacle of bolt-action rifle design. They were about to discover that in war the perfect can be the enemy of the good enough, and that volume of fire delivered rapidly could be more lethal than theoretical accuracy. The rifle those British soldiers carried was the short-magazine Lee-Enfield, known simply as the SMLE, a weapon that had entered service just 12 years earlier, on December 23, 1902. At 44.5 inches long with a 25-inch barrel, it was shorter than most military rifles of its era, a design choice that had sparked fierce debate among British rifle associations, who believed that accuracy demanded a longer barrel. The rifle weighed just under 9 pounds, fed from a 10-round detachable box magazine, and fired the .303 British cartridge, a rimmed round that many considered inferior to the newer rimless designs being adopted by other nations. But what made the Lee-Enfield truly different, what would make it the fastest bolt-action rifle ever issued to a major military force, was its bolt design. Unlike the Mauser 98 and most other military rifles, which locked their bolts at the front with lugs that engaged the receiver ring, the Lee-Enfield used rear locking lugs positioned near the back of the bolt. This seemingly minor design difference had profound implications. The rear locking system allowed for a shorter bolt throw of just 60 degrees compared to the Mauser's 90 degrees. The bolt handle, positioned closer to the trigger, required less hand movement to cycle the action. The cocking piece engaged on bolt closure rather than opening, distributing the effort and making the action feel smoother and faster. The British Army had not stumbled upon this design by accident. The Lee-Enfield's lineage stretched back to 1888, and the magazine Lee-Metford, which incorporated the bolt action system designed by Scottish-American inventor James Paris Lee. Lee's genius was recognizing that a bolt didn't need to lock at the front to be strong enough for military service. His rear locking design, while sacrificing some theoretical rigidity, gained something far more valuable in combat: speed. When the British adopted deeper Enfield rifling in 1895 and increased the magazine capacity to 10 rounds, the magazine Lee-Enfield was born. The short rifle variant introduced in 1902 was the culmination of lessons learned in the brutal Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. That conflict had taught the British Army painful lessons. Boer marksmen, armed with Mauser 1895 rifles in 7mm caliber, had repeatedly outshot British soldiers at long range. The Mausers, with their flat-shooting cartridges and excellent sights, had inflicted humiliating casualties. But the Boers had also revealed something else. In close-range fighting, when battles devolved into desperate firefights, the side that could deliver the most lead in the shortest time often prevailed. The British had noticed that their magazine-fed Lee-Metfords, despite being less accurate than Mausers at extreme range, were devastatingly effective in rapid-fire engagements. A British soldier who could work his bolt fast enough could put 15 to 20 aim shots downrange in a minute. A Boer with a Mauser might manage 10 to 12. This revelation led the British Army to develop a training program unlike any other in the world. Beginning in 1902, every British infantryman underwent intensive marksmanship training that emphasized rapid, accurate fire. The centerpiece of this training was an exercise that would become legendary. Practice number 22, rapid fire, from the musketry regulations of 1909, better known simply as the Mad Minute. The requirements were straightforward but demanding. A rifleman, lying prone with his rifle loaded and 4 rounds already in the magazine, would fire at a 48-inch target at 300 yards for exactly 60 seconds. During that minute, he had to reload from his ammunition pouch or bandolier using 5-round stripper clips. To qualify as a first-class shot, a soldier had to put at least 15 rounds on target. Good shots could achieve 20 to 25 hits. The very best could exceed 30. In 1908, Sergeant Major Jesse Wallingford set the first official mad minute record with 36 hits. In 1914, a musketry instructor named Sergeant Frank Snoxall of the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment achieved what many considered impossible, 38 hits, all within the inner 24-inch circle of the target. These weren't just impressive shooting demonstrations, they represented a fundamental British military philosophy. While other armies trained their soldiers to fire carefully aimed volleys, conserving ammunition and emphasising precision, the British believed that putting overwhelming fire on the enemy as quickly as possible would win firefights. The Lee-Enfield, with its 10-round magazine, smooth bolt action, and robust design, was the perfect tool for this doctrine. The technical features that enabled this rapid fire were subtle but crucial. The bolt's helical locking lugs, cut at a slight angle, allowed the action to cam into battery even with slightly dirty ammunition. The absence of front-locking lugs meant there were no receiver recesses at the front of the action to trap mud or debris. The bolt could be operated with the thumb while maintaining a firing grip, allowing for minimal disruption of the shooting position. The 10-round magazine capacity, double that of the Mauser's 5 rounds, meant fewer reloads. The stripper clip guide, mounted on the bolt head, allowed for rapid reloading without removing the magazine from the rifle. Every element of the design prioritised speed of fire. The men of the British Expeditionary Force who arrived in France in August 1914 were the products of this training system. Unlike the conscript armies of France and Germany, the BF was composed entirely of long-service volunteers and reservists, men who had been soldiers for years and had fired thousands of rounds in practice. The average British infantryman arriving at Mons had probably fired more ammunition in training than the average German conscript would fire in his entire military service. They knew their Lee-Enfields intimately. They could field strip them in darkness, clear stoppages by feel, estimate range by eye, and work their bolts with mechanical precision. They were the most highly trained marksmen in any army in Europe. The Germans were about to learn what that meant. At approximately 9 a.m. on August 23, 1914, German artillery opened fire on British positions along the Mont Condé Canal. For 90 minutes, shells rained down on the British lines. It was an impressive bombardment by the standards of 1914, though nothing compared to what would come later in the war. The British soldiers, veterans of colonial campaigns but new to modern artillery, huddled in their hastily dug trenches and waited. When the barrage lifted, German infantry advanced in massed formations, the tactics that had worked in their swift victories over Belgium. The British soldiers, many of them concealed in buildings along the canal, checked their rifles and waited for the order to fire. The first German assault came at the Nimy Bridge, a strategic crossing point where the 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, had established strong positions. Lieutenant Maurice Dees commanded a machine gun position covering the bridge approaches. Private Sidney Godley manned a second machine gun on the Gullin railway bridge nearby. As German infantry from multiple battalions advanced toward the bridges in dense formations, Dees and Godley opened fire with their Maxim machine guns, but it was the rifle fire that stunned the Germans. From concealed positions, British infantrymen armed with Lee-Enfields began firing with a speed and accuracy that the advancing Germans had never experienced. From the German perspective, the sound must have been incomprehensible. Instead of the measured crack, crack, crack of aimed rifle volleys, they heard a continuous roar, an almost unbroken stream of fire that swept through their ranks like an invisible scythe. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The Germans, trained to recognize the distinctive hammering sound of machine guns, believed they were facing massed automatic weapons. Their after-action reports would claim they had encountered 28 machine guns per battalion. In reality, each British battalion had exactly 2 machine guns. What the Germans were hearing was 800 British soldiers, each armed with an SMLE, each capable of delivering 15 to 30 aimed shots per minute. The mathematics of this firepower were devastating. A single British battalion of 1,000 men, with 800 riflemen firing at a conservative 15 rounds per minute, could theoretically deliver 12,000 rounds per minute. Even accounting for reloading, changing positions, and targets of opportunity, a battalion could easily sustain 6,000 to 8,000 rounds per minute. This was equivalent to 75 to 100 belt-fed machine guns, and unlike machine guns, which had to be carefully positioned and were vulnerable to suppressive fire, these were individual riflemen, dispersed across hundreds of yards of front, each one a mobile weapons system capable of independent action. The Germans had never faced anything like it. The Brandenburg Grenadiers, attacking the positions of the 1st Battalion, Royal West Kent Regiment, lost 25 officers and 500 men in their initial assault. The 75th Bremen Regiment, advancing on other British positions, suffered 5 officers and 376 men killed or wounded in a single attack. These losses were not the result of artillery or machine guns. They were the product of trained British infantrymen working their Lee-Enfield bolts as fast as their hands could move, firing, cycling, acquiring the next target, firing again, in a rhythm that became almost mechanical. The British soldiers had trained for exactly this scenario. They had fired so many mad minutes that the motions were instinctive. Shoulder the rifle, acquire the sight picture, squeeze the trigger, ride the recoil, thumb the bolt handle up, pull back, push forward, down, acquire the next target, fire. Over and over until the magazine ran empty, then a smooth transition, left hand comes up with a 5-round stripper clip, thumb it into the action, return to firing grip, resume firing. 10 seconds for a full reload, then back to the rhythm. German soldiers who survived the assaults at Mons would describe the experience in terms that bordered on the supernatural. One account, preserved in regimental histories, described it as encountering a wall of lead. We could see no targets, only muzzle flashes from windows and entrenchments, yet we were being cut down as if by scythes. The sound was not the crack of rifles we knew from training, but a continuous thunder. Our officers shouted for us to advance, but there was nowhere to advance to that was not swept by fire. We tried to take cover, but there was no cover. Men simply fell where they stood. It was not battle, it was execution. By afternoon, General von Kluck's confidence had evaporated. His forces had achieved some local successes, crossing the canal in several places, but at cost that shocked the German command. Against a numerically inferior enemy, the First Army had suffered between 3,000 and 5,000 casualties in a single day. The British, with their backs to the canal and limited room for manoeuvre, had lost approximately 1,600 men. The casualty exchange ratio in favour of the defenders was exactly what British doctrine had predicted. Rapid, accurate rifle fire could multiply the defensive strength of a position by factors of 3 or 4. The Lee-Enfield in trained hands had proven the doctrine sound. The Battle of Mons produced numerous acts of heroism that would enter British military legend. Lieutenant Dees, manning his machine gun despite being shot multiple times, continued firing until he was mortally wounded, earning the first Victoria Cross of World War I. Private Godley, taking over Dees's position, held the bridge single-handedly until ordered to withdraw, firing his machine gun until captured, earning him the second Victoria Cross. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Mons was the myth it created among the Germans. For the remainder of the war, German soldiers who had fought at Mons would tell younger recruits about the terror of facing British rifle fire, about how the English didn't use rifles, they used machine guns disguised as rifles. This belief that British units possessed far more machine guns than they actually had persisted throughout 1914 and into 1915. German intelligence officers, receiving combat reports that consistently overestimated British automatic weapons, eventually accepted these inflated numbers as fact. The psychological impact was significant. German soldiers advancing against British positions expected to face massed machine gun fire, and often took casualties far in excess of what the actual firepower should have inflicted, simply because they bunched up or hesitated, expecting automatic weapons that weren't there. The sound of massed Lee-Enfield fire, that continuous roar unlike the measured cadence of German Mauser volleys, reinforced the belief that they faced machine guns. The technical reasons the Lee-Enfield achieved this rate of fire reveal how small design choices can have enormous consequences. Consider the bolt throw. The Mauser 98, with its 90-degree bolt lift, required the shooter to break their cheek weld from the stock to clear the bolt handle. The action had to come up, back, forward and down through a complete quarter circle. The Lee-Enfield's 60-degree throw allowed a shooter to maintain cheek contact throughout the cycle. The bolt handle, positioned further back and lower, could be operated with a shorter, more efficient motion. Time saved about a quarter of a second per shot. Over a mad minute, that quarter second multiplied to 15 seconds of additional firing time, perhaps 5 or 6 more rounds on target. The rear-locking lugs, criticised by precision shooters for introducing flex into the action, had combat advantages that more than offset their theoretical accuracy deficit. With no front-locking surfaces to trap debris, the action was remarkably resistant to fouling. British soldiers fighting in the mud of Flanders would discover that their Lee-Enfields would continue functioning in conditions that rendered Mausers inoperable. The bolt face and breech, both smooth and easily accessible, could be quickly wiped clean even in darkness. The headspace adjustment system, which allowed armourers to fine-tune the rifle by swapping bolt heads, meant that rifles could be kept in service despite wear or damage that would have retired other weapons. The 10-round magazine proved to be perhaps the most significant advantage. German soldiers armed with Mausers carried 5 rounds in their rifles. After 5 shots, they had to reload. British soldiers could fire 10 rounds before needing a fresh clip. In a sustained firefight, this meant British soldiers were reloading half as often. Since a reload took roughly 10 seconds for either rifle, the British soldier spent 50% less time reloading and 50% more time shooting. Over the course of a 5-minute engagement, a British soldier might fire 75 to 100 rounds, while his German counterpart fired 50 to 60. The difference in bullets delivered multiplied across a battalion became decisive. The .303 British cartridge, often dismissed as inferior to newer designs, proved entirely adequate for its intended purpose. The Mark 7 round, introduced in 1910, fired a 174-grain Spitzer bullet at 2,140 feet per second. While not as flat-shooting as the German 7.92 mm or French 8mm rounds at extreme range, it was entirely effective out to 600 yards, the range at which most infantry combat actually occurred. The rimmed case design, considered old-fashioned by 1914, actually aided extraction under dirty conditions. The rim provided a positive purchase for the extractor, reducing the chance of extraction failures that plagued some rimless designs when chambers became fouled. In combat conditions, reliability trumped ballistic perfection. The British soldiers' loadout maximised the Lee-Enfield's capabilities. Each infantryman carried 150 rounds of ammunition in web pouches, arranged in 10-round charger clips ready for rapid loading. The web gear allowed for quick access to ammunition without fumbling with pouches or buttons. During intense firefights, British soldiers would often place charger clips on the ground beside them or in their helmets, enabling reloads in 2 to 3 seconds rather than the 10 seconds required to extract a clip from a pouch. These small tactical adaptations, learned through training and refined in combat, transformed a good rifle into a devastating weapon system. The German Mauser 8, by contrast, embodied different priorities. Its 2-lug front-locking system provided maximum rigidity, making it theoretically more accurate than the Lee-Enfield. The controlled feed system, which grabbed the cartridge rim as soon as it left the magazine, ensured reliable feeding even when the rifle was operated slowly or at odd angles. The 3-position safety was positive and easy to operate. The bolt strip process was straightforward. For target shooting or deliberate long-range fire, the Mauser was arguably superior. But in a rapid-fire engagement at 300 yards, where speed mattered more than precision, where reliability under abuse was more important than accuracy from a rest, where getting 20 rounds downrange in a minute mattered more than grouping in 4 inches at 600 yards, the Lee-Enfield was the better weapon. This fundamental difference in design philosophy reflected different military cultures. The German army, with its emphasis on discipline and coordinated action, viewed the rifle as one element in a system that included machine guns, artillery, and massed manoeuvre. Individual marksmanship, while valued, was secondary to unit cohesion and combined arms tactics. The British Army, with its tradition of colonial warfare against often numerically superior opponents, had learned that individual firepower could compensate for numerical disadvantage. A British battalion that could deliver twice the rifle fire of its German equivalent could hold positions that should have been overrun. As World War I devolved into trench warfare following the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, the Lee-Enfield's advantages became even more pronounced. The muddy, cramped conditions of trench fighting favoured weapons that were compact, easy to operate in confined spaces, and resistant to fouling. The SMLE excelled in all these areas. its shorter overall length made it easier to maneuver in narrow trenches than longer rifles. The rear-locking bolt design meant mud and debris were less likely to jam the action. The smooth bolt face and breech could be cleaned quickly with a pull-through and oily rag that every soldier carried in the trapdoor in the rifle's buttstock. German soldiers, issued the longer Gewehr 98, found their rifles unwieldy in trenches and often resorted to sawing off barrels or requisitioning captured weapons. The Mauser's longer receiver and bolt throw made it awkward to operate while crouched or prone in a trench. The front locking lugs, while strong, created recesses in the receiver that filled with mud and froze in winter, causing extraction failures. German armourers struggled to keep Mausers functioning in conditions that Lee-Enfields handled routinely. After-action reports from German units frequently mentioned rifle malfunctions due to fouling, while British reports rarely mentioned such issues. The Battle of First Ypres in Diels, October and November 1914 would further demonstrate the Lee-Enfield's effectiveness. During the desperate fighting around Ypres, where the BF fought off numerically superior German attacks, British rifle fire repeatedly broke up German assaults. At Langemarck on October 21st, where German reserve divisions consisting largely of student volunteers attacked British positions, the results were catastrophic for the attackers. The German units, filled with enthusiastic but poorly trained men, advanced in dense formations against entrenched British regulars. What followed became known to the Germans as the Massacre of the Innocents. Approximately 25,000 German casualties, many of them killed by rifle fire from British soldiers working their Lee-Enfields with mechanical precision. Survivors described walls of bullets, continuous fire that never seemed to slacken, the impossibility of advancing against such volume of fire. British soldiers, many of them now veterans of 3 months of continuous combat, had refined their rapid-fire techniques to near perfection. They could change positions while reloading, acquire targets by instinct, estimate range without conscious thought, and maintain sustained fire for minutes at a time. The Lee-Enfield in their hands had become an extension of their bodies, operated with the same unconscious skill with which they walked or breathed. The rifle's reliability under sustained fire was remarkable. Unlike some designs that experienced extraction failures when chambers became hot, the Lee-Enfield's robust extractor and cam action continued functioning after hundreds of rounds. The barrel, while not particularly heavy, could withstand extended firing without losing accuracy or experiencing significant heat-related issues. British soldiers reported firing 200 to 300 rounds in a single engagement without experiencing malfunctions. The actions remained smooth, even after thousands of rounds without cleaning, a testament to the generous tolerances and smart engineering of the Lee design. One aspect of the Lee-Enfield that is often overlooked is its role in sniper operations. While the rifle was not as inherently accurate as target rifles or specially tuned Mausers, it was accurate enough for military purposes. At ranges up to 600 yards, a good shooter with an SMLE could reliably hit a man-sized target. For sniping, selected rifles were fitted with telescopic sights, typically the Aldi's or periscopic prism pattern 1918 sights. These sniper rifles, while not quite matching the precision of German sniper Mausers or the later pattern 1914 rifles also used by British snipers, had one enormous advantage: magazine capacity. A German sniper with a Mauser had 5 shots before needing to reload, a vulnerable moment. A British sniper with an SMLE had 10 shots, allowing for multiple engagements before reloading. The pattern 1914 rifle deserves mention as it represents an interesting counterpoint to the Lee-Enfield story, developed in response to the Boer War experience and designed to compete with the Mauser at long range. The P14 used a modified Mauser-style action with front-locking lugs, a more powerful .276 cartridge, and advanced aperture sights. It was more accurate than the SMLE, more durable, and arguably a better rifle for long-range precision shooting. But it was also heavier, held only 5 rounds, and had a slower rate of fire. When World War I broke out, the British government chose to continue production of the SMLE rather than transition to the P14, recognising that rapid fire was more valuable than long-range accuracy. The P14 was produced in limited numbers in the United States and used primarily as a sniper rifle, while the SMLE remained the standard infantry weapon. This decision proved correct. While the P14 was technically superior in many ways, the tactical reality of World War I favoured volume of fire. Most combat occurred at ranges under 400 yards, where the SMLE's theoretical accuracy disadvantage was irrelevant. The ability to put 30 rounds per minute downrange was more valuable than the ability to hit a target at 800 yards. British doctrine had been vindicated. The generals and training instructors who had pushed for rapid-fire training over long-range marksmanship had correctly predicted the nature of modern warfare. As the war progressed and casualties mounted, replacing the highly trained pre-war regulars, the British Army adapted its training. The new volunteers and conscripts did not receive the same intensive marksmanship training as the original BEF. The average skill level declined, but even with less training, British soldiers armed with Lee-Enfields could achieve rates of fire that exceeded other armies. The rifle's inherent speed advantage meant that even an average shooter could manage 12 to 15 aimed rounds per minute with practice. This was still faster than a highly trained German soldier with a Mauser could achieve. The weapon itself provided a tactical advantage that partially compensated for reduced training time. The assembly saw continuous production throughout World War I, with millions of rifles manufactured in Britain, Australia and India. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, the London Small Arms Company, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, Lithgow, Small Arms Factory in Australia, and Rifle Factory Ishapur in India all produced variants of the rifle. The Mk3, introduced in 1907, became the standard model. In 1916, a simplified variant, the Mk3, was introduced. This version eliminated the magazine cutoff, the windage-adjustable rear sight, and the volley sights, features that experience had shown were rarely used in combat. The simplification sped production without reducing the rifle's essential capabilities. By the end of World War I, the Lee-Enfield had become synonymous with British military power. German soldiers had learned to recognise the distinctive sound of massed SMLE fire and to respect the men who carried them. The rifle had proven itself in every theatre of the war, from the Western Front to Gallipoli, from Mesopotamia to East Africa. It had functioned in mud, sand, snow and jungle. It had been carried by soldiers from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India and dozens of other nations. It had fired millions of rounds in combat and had become, in the words of one historian, the right arm of the Empire. The rifle continued in British service through World War II and beyond, with improved variants including the No. 4 Mackay introduced in the 1930s. The No. 4 featured a heavier barrel, improved aperture sights, and manufacturing simplifications that made it easier and cheaper to produce. During World War II, millions more were manufactured in Britain, Canada, and the United States. The rifle remained in British military service until 1957, when it was finally replaced by the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a semi-automatic weapon. Even then, Lee-Enfields continued in use for decades, with India manufacturing them until at least the 1980s, and police and military forces in former British colonies using them well into the 21st century. The total production of Lee-Enfield rifles in all variants exceeded 17 million, making it one of the most produced rifles in history. It served in more wars, in more countries, over a longer period of time than perhaps any other rifle design. From the Boer War through World War I, World War II, Korea, various colonial conflicts and even modern irregular warfare, the Lee-Enfield proved itself time and again. Its longevity is testament to the soundness of its design. The Lee-Enfield also found extensive use in civilian hands. After both world wars, surplus rifles flooded the civilian market. They became popular among target shooters, who appreciated the smooth action and generous magazine capacity, and among hunters, who valued the rifle's reliability and adequate power for medium game. Thousands of Lee-Enfields were sporterized, fitted with better stocks, scoped, and used for deer hunting. Even today, in the 21st century, Lee-Enfields remain popular among shooters who appreciate bolt-action rifles and military history. Looking back at the Battle of Mons and the events of August 1914, it's clear that the Lee-Enfield played a crucial role in the survival of the British Expeditionary Force. If the BEF had been armed with slower-firing rifles, if British soldiers had not been trained in rapid fire, the German numerical advantage at Mons might have been decisive. The BEF might have been destroyed in the opening weeks of the war, potentially changing the entire course of the conflict. Instead, the combination of highly trained soldiers and a rifle, designed for rapid fire, allowed a small professional army to hold off a much larger force, buying time for France and Britain to mobilise their full strength. The German army eventually adapted to British firepower, developing new tactics, increasing their own machine, gun allocations and emphasizing combined arms coordination. But they never solved the fundamental problem that British infantry, armed with Lee-Enfields and trained in rapid fire, could deliver more rifle fire per man than German infantry. Throughout the war, German commanders had to account for this British advantage when planning operations. British battalions punched above their weight because of their weapons and training. In the broader context of military history, the Lee-Enfield represents an important lesson about the relationship between design, doctrine, and effectiveness. The rifle was not the most accurate, not the most powerful, not the most elegant or theoretically perfect. It was, however, perfectly suited to the doctrine it was designed to support and the conditions in which it would be used. British military thinkers had correctly identified that modern warfare would favour rapid fire over precision, that volume of fire would be more valuable than long-range accuracy, that reliability under abuse would matter more than theoretical perfection. The Lee-Enfield embodied these priorities, and its combat record validated them. The legacy of the Lee-Enfield speed extends beyond the rifle itself. The Mad Minute tradition continues in various forms, with shooters around the world attempting to match the feats of those pre-World War I British soldiers. Modern competitions using authentic Lee-Enfields see skilled shooters achieving 30, 35, even nearly 40 hits on target in a minute, matching the record set over a century ago. These demonstrations serve as reminders of the skill level that was routine in the old British Army, of men who could work a bolt-action rifle with a speed that seems almost superhuman today. The technological evolution of infantry weapons has, of course, moved far beyond bolt-action rifles. Semi-automatic rifles, select-fire assault rifles, and advanced optical sights have transformed infantry combat. A modern soldier with an emboss or carbine can deliver far more firepower, far more accurately than a World War I soldier with an SMALE. But the fundamental principle that the British identified, that rapid, sustained fire is often more valuable than precision, remains valid. Modern military doctrine still emphasizes volume of fire, suppression of enemy positions, and the importance of getting rounds downrange quickly. In museums and collections around the world, Lee-Enfield rifles remain among the most common military artifacts. Their abundance is a testament to their widespread use, but it also means that these rifles remain affordable and accessible to historians and collectors. Handling a well-maintained SMLE M3 today, working its smooth bolt action, feeling the balance and weight that seem natural to millions of soldiers, provides a tangible connection to history. These rifles are not abstract museum pieces but functional machines that still work as designed over a century after their manufacture. The men who carried Lee-Enfields into battle, particularly those original members of the British Expeditionary Force who fought at Mons, were extraordinary soldiers. They represented the end of an era of professional long-service military forces trained to standards that would never be replicated as armies grew larger and more dependent on conscription. Their skill with their rifles was the product of thousands of hours of practice, of year after year of live-fire training, of a military culture that valued marksmanship above almost everything else. When they faced the German army in August 1914, they were perhaps the finest body of riflemen ever fielded by any nation. The story of how the Lee-Enfield speed stunned advancing German infantry is ultimately a story about the intersection of technology, training, and doctrine. The rifle provided the potential for rapid fire through its rear-locking bolt, short throw, and large magazine. The training transformed that potential into reality, teaching men to operate the rifle at speeds that seemed impossible. The doctrine emphasized the importance of that speed, making rapid fire the centerpiece of British infantry tactics. All three elements, technology, training, and doctrine, had to align for the system to work. At Mons in August 1914, they aligned perfectly, and the German army discovered that the contemptible little British force was anything but contemptible. The thunder of massed Lee-Enfield fire, that continuous roar that German soldiers mistook for machine guns, was the sound of an idea made real, the sound of doctrine validated in blood and fire. It was the sound that halted the German advance at Mons, that broke the German attacks at First Ypres, that echoed across battlefields from France to Turkey to Africa. It was the sound of British military tradition, of empire, of professionalism and training taken to their highest expression. And it was the sound of a rifle designed not to be perfect, but to be fast, doing exactly what it was designed to do. When Hauptmann Schmidt raised his head above his cover that afternoon at Mons, after hours of watching his men cut down by invisible fire, after seeing assault after assault broken up by what seemed like endless streams of bullets, he finally understood what he was facing. Not an overwhelming number of machine guns, not some secret weapon, but simply British soldiers doing what they had been trained to do, working their bolt-action rifles as fast as their hands could move, firing and reloading and firing again with mechanical precision. The contemptible little British force had earned respect the hardest way possible, by proving in combat that sometimes the side with the better trained men and the faster firing rifles wins, regardless of what the numbers say. The Lee-Enfield was retired from British military service in 1957, ending a 62-year career as a frontline infantry weapon. But its influence extended far beyond its years of service. It demonstrated that design compromises made for tactical reasons can be more valuable than theoretical perfection. It proved that training matters as much as technology. It showed that understanding how weapons will actually be used in combat, rather than how they perform in ideal conditions, should drive design decisions. These lessons remain relevant today as military planners evaluate new weapon systems and training programs. In the end, the Lee-Enfield was more than just a rifle. It was a force multiplier, a system that transformed trained men into weapon systems capable of delivering firepower far beyond what their numbers suggested. It was a testament to British military culture, to the value placed on individual skill and marksmanship. It was a vindication of doctrine, of the belief that rapid fire wins firefights. And it was, for the German soldiers who faced it in August 1914, a shocking revelation that the British army they had dismissed as contemptible was, in fact, the most lethal per capita infantry force in the world. The thunder of those Lee-Enfields at Mons announced that the Great War would not be won quickly or easily, that British soldiers would fight with skill and determination, and that underestimating them would be a fatal mistake. The sound stunned the Germans then, and it echoes still in the history of infantry warfare. The technical evolution of the Lee-Enfield during the interwar years reflected lessons learned from 4 years of industrial warfare. The No. 4 Meche-Wankin, which began development in the 1920s but wasn't officially adopted until 1941, incorporated changes that would have seemed minor to casual observers but were significant to the soldiers who carried them. The rear sight was moved from its position on the barrel to a location on the receiver bridge, improving the sight radius and making the rifle more accurate. The new aperture sight was faster to use than the open notch sight of the SMLE, allowing for quicker target acquisition. The barrel was heavier and slightly longer, improving accuracy and reducing barrel wear during sustained fire, but the fundamental action remained unchanged. The rear-locking lugs, the 60-degree bolt throw, the 10-round magazine, all the features that had made the SMLE the fastest bolt-action rifle in the world were retained in the No. 4. British military planners, having seen countless attempts by other nations to improve on proven designs, only to introduce new problems, chose evolution over revolution. The No. 4 was approximately 20% more accurate than the SMLE, fired from sandbag rests in test conditions, but retained all the handling characteristics and speed that had made the earlier rifle so effective. It was the SMLE refined, not replaced. During World War II, the Lee-Enfield faced an entirely different kind of opponent than it had in 1914. The German army of 1939 was mechanized, equipped with modern submachine guns and semi-automatic rifles, in addition to bolt-action Mausers, and supported by overwhelming firepower from artillery and aircraft. Yet British soldiers armed with Lee-Enfields held their own in countless engagements, from Norway to North Africa, from Burma to Normandy. The rifle that had been designed to fight colonial wars and had proven itself in the trenches of World War I remained relevant in the age of blitzkrieg. At Dunkirk in May and June 1940, as the British Expeditionary Force fought its desperate rearguard action to allow the evacuation of 338,000 troops, Lee-Enfields played a crucial role in holding off German advances. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, making its stand at Le Paradis on May 27th, held off elements of the SS Totenkopf division for hours despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The sustained rifle fire from British positions, that same rapid fire that had stunned the Germans at Mons 26 years earlier, repeatedly broke up German attacks. When the Norfolks finally ran out of ammunition and surrendered, 97 prisoners of war were murdered by their SS captors in an atrocity that would become one of the war crimes trials after the war. The ferocity of the British defence, enabled by rapid Lee-Enfield fire, had so enraged the SS troops that they committed this barbaric act. In North Africa, the Lee-Enfield proved ideally suited to desert warfare. The open bolt design and generous tolerances meant sand and dust, which would have jammed tighter tolerance rifles, had minimal effect on Lee-Enfield function. British and Commonwealth troops fighting across Libya and Egypt found their rifles required minimal maintenance to keep functioning in conditions that were incredibly harsh on mechanical devices. A daily wipe down with an oily rag, a quick pass-through with the pull-through cleaning cord, and the rifle was ready for another day. German soldiers, particularly those armed with the MP40 submachine gun with its tight tolerances and vulnerability to sand ingress, often found their weapons malfunctioning while British Lee-Enfields continued firing. The Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942 saw Lee-Enfields in the hands of British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian troops breaking Rommel's Afrika Korps. During the initial infantry assault on the night of October 23rd, thousands of British and Commonwealth soldiers advanced through minefields and barbed wire under heavy fire. The Lee-Enfield's ability to maintain rapid fire while advancing, to be operated effectively in any position, proved crucial. Soldiers advancing across open ground under fire needed weapons they could shoot without stopping, could reload while moving, could operate while crouched or prone behind minimal cover. The Lee-Enfield allowed all this. Private Victor Gregg of the Rifle Brigade, fighting at El Alamein, later described the importance of the rifle's magazine capacity during the close-quarter fighting that developed once British troops penetrated German defensive positions. When you're fighting at night in a trench system, the side that can put more bullets downrange without stopping to reload has an enormous advantage. The German with his Mauser had 5 shots, then he's vulnerable. We had 10. In a close engagement, that extra 5 rounds could mean the difference between killing the other bloke or getting killed yourself. More than once I emptied a magazine into a position, then charged while they were still reacting. The Lee-Enfield's capacity saved my life multiple times. In the Pacific Theatre, Australian troops armed with Lee-Enfields fought Japanese forces in some of the most difficult terrain and conditions imaginable. The jungles of New Guinea, where rainfall could exceed 200 inches per year, where mud was constant, where weapons corroded overnight if not meticulously maintained, proved the Lee-Enfield's legendary reliability. Australian soldiers fighting along the Kokoda Track in 1942, holding back Japanese forces attempting to capture Port Moresby, found their Lee-Enfields functioning reliably despite conditions that would have rendered many other rifles useless. The rifle's simple design, with few small parts and generous tolerances, meant it could absorb abuse that would disable more refined weapons. The Japanese Type 99 Arisaka rifle, while well made and accurate, held only 5 rounds and had a slower bolt throw than the Lee-Enfield. In the close-range jungle fighting that characterized the Pacific War, where engagements often occurred at ranges of 50 yards or less, the Lee-Enfield's rapid-fire capability and magazine capacity provided a significant advantage. Australian soldiers, many of them veterans of the North African campaign, had refined their rapid-fire techniques to suit jungle conditions. Short, sharp bursts of fire delivered at maximum speed could suppress enemy positions long enough for flanking movements or grenade throws. The Lee-Enfield enabled these tactics. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of Lee-Enfield effectiveness in the Pacific occurred during the Battle of Milne Bay in August and September 1942. Australian militia troops, dismissed by some as second-rate compared to the AIF veterans fighting in North Africa, faced Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces attempting to capture the airstrip at Milne Bay. The Australian 61st Battalion, armed with Lee-Enfields and supported by limited artillery, fought off repeated Japanese attacks. The rapid rifle fire from Australian positions convinced Japanese commanders they faced a much larger force than was actually present. The Japanese, accustomed to quickly overwhelming poorly armed Chinese troops or Filipino defenders, were shocked by the volume of fire the Australians could deliver. Captain Theo Gavrilides of the 61st Battalion reported that his company, 120 men armed primarily with rifles, held off an entire Japanese battalion for 6 hours on the night of August 30th. The key was maintaining continuous fire, never allowing the Japanese to mass for an assault. We'd learned the old mad-minute drills, the rapid-fire techniques the regulars used. That night we put everything we'd learned into practice. My boys fired until their barrels were too hot to touch, reloaded until their thumbs were bleeding from pushing stripper clips, and kept firing. The Japanese never got closer than 50 yards. When dawn came, we counted over 200 bodies in front of our position. We lost 11 men. The Lee-Enfield did that. The Burma campaign from 1942 to 1945 presented perhaps the most challenging conditions any rifle faced during World War II. Monsoon rains, extreme heat, humidity that caused metal to rust within hours, leeches, insects, and disease all combined to create an environment where equipment failures were routine. British and Indian troops fighting the Japanese in Burma found the Lee-Enfield to be one of the few weapons that continued functioning reliably. The rifle's simple design and robust construction meant it could be maintained even under jungle conditions with minimal supplies. The Chindits, British Special Forces operating behind Japanese lines in Burma, relied heavily on their Lee-Enfields. Operating for months at a time without resupply, far from armories or workshops, the Chindits needed weapons that wouldn't fail. Major Michael Calvert, commanding the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade during the second Chindit operation in 1944, specifically praised the Lee-Enfield in his after-action reports. We operated 200 miles behind enemy lines for 14 weeks. In that time, rifle failures were almost non-existent. The Lee-Enfield, maintained with nothing more than oil and a pull-through, continued working. By contrast, our Bren guns required constant attention, and the American weapons we'd been issued for trial, Thompson submachine guns and M1 carbines, gave us endless problems in the jungle environment. The Lee-Enfield was the one weapon we could absolutely count on. The rifle also proved its worth in the hands of Allied sniper teams. While not as inherently accurate as purpose-built sniper rifles, the No. 4 Magweiss with the No. 32 telescopic sight was accurate enough for military sniping out to 600 yards, the range at which most sniper engagements occurred. British and Commonwealth sniper teams armed with scoped Lee-Enfields claimed thousands of enemy casualties throughout the war. The rifle's magazine capacity gave snipers a significant advantage. A German sniper with a Carney 8K had 5 shots before reloading. A British sniper with a Lee-Enfield had 10. In situations where multiple targets presented themselves, the British sniper could engage twice as many targets before needing to reload, a vulnerable moment for any sniper. Sergeant Harry Furness of the British 13th Parachute Battalion, fighting in Normandy in 1944, used his scoped No. 4 to devastating effect during the defence of the Orne Bridges. Operating from a church tower overlooking German positions, Furness claimed 37 confirmed kills in the first 3 days after D-Day. His combat diary, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, describes his tactics. The Lee-Enfield's magazine capacity was crucial. I'd identify a group of targets, perhaps an officer conferring with NCOs or a weapons team setting up a machine gun. With the Enfield, I could engage the entire group before they could react. First round on the officer, second on the radio man, third through fifth on anyone else who presented themselves. With a 5-round rifle, I'd have gotten the officer and maybe one other before needing to reload. The Enfield's 10-round magazine meant I could disrupt entire sections with a single magazine. The introduction of semi-automatic rifles by other nations during World War II, particularly the American M1 Garand, led some to question whether the Lee-Enfield had become obsolete. The Garand, adopted by the US Army in 1936, represented the future of infantry weapons. Semi-automatic fire, no bolt to cycle, 30 ME06 cartridge more powerful than the 303 British, it seemed superior in every way except one, magazine capacity. The Garand held 8 rounds in an N-block clip that had to be fully expended before reloading. The Lee-Enfield held 10 rounds and could be topped off at any time. In combat, this difference mattered. British soldiers fighting alongside American troops in Italy and northwest Europe noted that American riflemen were often reloading at inconvenient moments. The distinctive ping of an empty Garand clip ejecting became a signal to enemy soldiers that the American was temporarily vulnerable. By contrast, British soldiers with Lee-Enfields could reload partially empty magazines during lulls in fighting, ensuring they always had ammunition ready. The bolt-action rifle, far from being obsolete, retained significant advantages in trained hands. Field Marshal William Slim, commanding the 14th Army in Burma, was asked in 1944 whether he wanted his troops re-equipped with American M1 Garands or M1 carbines. His response was unequivocal. The Lee-Enfield is the finest weapon for jungle warfare ever devised. It never jams, requires minimal maintenance, holds more rounds than any other service rifle, and in trained hands can deliver fire nearly as rapid as a semi-automatic. My Indian and British soldiers are trained on the Enfield and have complete confidence in it. Changing weapons now would reduce effectiveness, not enhance it. We'll keep our Enfields. The Soviet Union also evaluated the Lee-Enfield during the war, as Britain supplied weapons to the USSR under Lend-Lease. Soviet testers found the rifle's accuracy adequate and its rate of fire impressive, but ultimately retained their Mosin-Nagant rifles. The reasons were pragmatic rather than technical. The Soviet Union had millions of Mosin-Nagants in service, enormous stocks of 7.62 54R ammunition, and production facilities optimized for the Mosin design. Changing to a new rifle would have disrupted production and required new ammunition, manufacturing. However, Soviet reports acknowledged that the Lee-Enfield was probably the better weapon, particularly in its rate of fire and magazine capacity. The comparison between the Lee-Enfield and other World War II rifles reveals interesting design trade-offs. The German Kar-98K, essentially a shortened version of the World War I Gewehr 98, was more accurate than the Lee-Enfield at long range, but held only 5 rounds and had a slower rate of fire. The Soviet Mosin-Nagant was rugged and reliable, but had a clunky bolt action, harsh recoil, and held only 5 rounds. The American M1 1903 Springfield was accurate and well made, but again held only 5 rounds, and was slower to operate than the Lee-Enfield. The Japanese Arisaka was light and handy, but held only 5 rounds. Only the Lee-Enfield combined a 10-round magazine with a truly rapid bolt action. The semi-automatic rifles, the M1 Garand and Soviet SVT-40, offered faster rates of fire, but at the cost of complexity, maintenance requirements, and, in the Garand's case, limited magazine capacity. The submachine guns like the Thompson, MP40 and Sten offered high rates of automatic fire, but were effective only at close range and consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. The Lee-Enfield occupied a middle ground, not as fast as a semi-automatic or submachine gun, not as long-ranged as a purpose-built sniper rifle, but versatile, reliable, and effective across the ranges where most infantry combat actually occurred. As World War II ended and the Cold War began, most nations transitioned to semi-automatic rifles. The US had its M1 Garand and would soon develop the M14. The Soviets developed the SKS, and then the AK-47. The Germans, divided, would adopt the G3 and AK variants. Britain, economically exhausted by the war, continued using the Lee-Enfield while developing a new rifle. The result, adopted in 1957, was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a licensed version of the Belgian FN FAL. The Lee-Enfield was finally retired from frontline British service after 55 years. But retirement from British service did not mean the end of the Lee-Enfield's combat career. Former British colonies and Commonwealth nations continued using the rifle for decades. The Indian Army manufactured Lee-Enfields at the rifle factory Ishapur until at least 1980, producing millions of rifles chambered in both .303 British and 7.62 Lilestos NATO. Pakistani forces used Lee-Enfields in the 1965 and 1971 wars with India. Afghan Mujahideen used Lee-Enfields supplied by Pakistan and captured from Soviet-backed Afghan forces during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. The rifle appeared in conflicts across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East well into the 21st century. The longevity of the Lee-Enfield in military service, spanning from 1895 to at least 2014, when reports indicated Lee-Enfields were still in limited use with Canadian Rangers in the Arctic and police forces in various nations, is unprecedented. No other magazine-fed, bolt-action rifle served continuously for 119 years. This longevity reflects several factors beyond the rifle's technical merits. The enormous production numbers meant spare parts were readily available. The simple design meant repairs could be made with basic tools. The .303 British cartridge, while old-fashioned, remained in production worldwide, and the rifle simply worked year after year, decade after decade, requiring minimal maintenance and delivering reliable performance. The cultural impact of the Lee-Enfield on British and Commonwealth military tradition cannot be overstated. For generations of soldiers from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, and dozens of other nations, the Lee-Enfield was their first experience with military weapons. The rifle became synonymous with service, with empire, with shared military heritage. veterans meeting decades after their service could bond over shared experiences with the rifle, comparing techniques for working the bolt faster, debating the best methods for zeroing the sights, sharing stories of the rifle's reliability or occasional quirks. The Mad Minute tradition, that intense 1-minute test of rapid fire that had been central to British rifle training since 1909, continued throughout the rifle's service life and persists today as a competitive event. Modern competitions see shooters using authentic Lee-Enfields attempting to match or exceed the record set by soldiers a century ago. The current world record, set in 2014 at a Mad Minute competition in the United Kingdom, stands at 38 hits on a 48-inch target at 300 yards in 60 seconds, matching the legendary performance of Sergeant Snoxall in 1914. These competitions serve as living connections to military history, keeping alive the skills and techniques that were once matters of survival. The Lee-Enfield also found extensive use in civilian marksmanship competitions. After both world wars, surplus rifles were sold to civilians at low prices, making them accessible to shooters with modest budgets. The rifle proved popular in target shooting competitions, particularly those emphasising rapid fire. The British National Rifle Association's service rifle competitions featured Lee-Enfields prominently for decades. Australian shooters used Lee-Enfields in their national competitions well into the 1980s. The rifle's accuracy, while not matching purpose-built target rifles, was entirely adequate for service rifle competitions, and its rapid-fire capability gave skilled shooters an advantage in timed events. In sporting use, the Lee-Enfield served hunters across the British Commonwealth for generations. Converted to sporting rifles with shortened barrels, better stocks, and often fitted with telescopic sights, Lee-Enfields took game ranging from rabbits to elephants. The .303 British cartridge, with proper bullet selection, was adequate for any non-dangerous game and acceptable for dangerous game in experienced hands. The rifle's reliability meant hunters could count on it in harsh conditions. Australian ranchers used Lee-Enfields for culling kangaroos and wild cattle. New Zealand hunters used them for deer and wild pigs. African farmers used them for crop protection and meat hunting. Canadian trappers used them for everything from small game to moose. The rifle's influence on subsequent British weapons design is evident in the EM2, the innovative bullpup rifle developed in the late 1940s that nearly became Britain's standard rifle before being rejected in favour of NATO standardisation. The EM2's designers, many of whom had carried Lee-Enfields in combat, incorporated several features that reflected Lee-Enfield influence. The 20-round detachable magazine, while using a different feeding system, reflected the British belief that magazine capacity mattered. The emphasis on controllability and ease of use over theoretical precision reflected lessons learned from the Lee-Enfield. Although the EM2 was never adopted, it influenced future British rifle designs, including the L85 bullpup that currently equips British forces. The technical specifications of the Lee-Enfield reveal why the design was so successful. The action, with its 2-lug bolt locking in the receiver bridge rather than the receiver ring, distributed stress over a larger area than most people realised. The bolt body, massive and robust, could withstand proof loads far exceeding normal operating pressures. The receiver, while not as rigid as the Mauser pattern, was more than strong enough for the .303 British cartridge's modest pressures. The rifling, with its distinctive 5-groove pattern and quick 10-inch twist, stabilised the long .303 bullet effectively while not wearing excessively. The sights, often criticised by target shooters, were actually well designed for combat use. The original SMLE's open notch rear sight, adjustable for range, could be set quickly and allowed rapid target acquisition. The No. 4's aperture sight, even better for fast shooting, provided a larger depth of field that made precise sight alignment unnecessary. Shooters could simply centre the front sight in the rear aperture and fire, achieving combat accuracy without the precise sight picture required for target shooting. This ease of use meant even hastily trained soldiers could shoot reasonably well with the Lee-Enfield. The safety mechanism, a rotating lever on the left side of the receiver behind the bolt handle, was positive and easy to operate even with gloved hands or in darkness. Unlike some safeties that could be accidentally disengaged, the Lee-Enfield safety required a deliberate motion to release. The trigger, while heavy by target standards at 5 to 7 pounds, was consistent and reliable. Experienced shooters learned to stage the trigger, taking up the slack, then applying final pressure when the sight picture was correct. The bayonet compatibility of the Lee-Enfield added another dimension to its combat effectiveness. The standard pattern 1907 bayonet, a 17-inch sword-type blade, transformed the rifle into a formidable close-quarters weapon. During World War I, British soldiers had repeatedly proven the effectiveness of the rifle and bayonet combination in trench raids and defensive fighting. The length of the rifle plus bayonet gave British soldiers reach advantages in close combat. The sturdy construction of both rifle and bayonet meant the combination could withstand the shock of hand-to-hand fighting without damage. The rifle's weight distribution, while not ideal from a purely ergonomic standpoint, proved well suited to its intended use. The muzzle-heavy balance caused by the barrel and forward handguard helped control muzzle rise during rapid fire. The thick wrist and pistol grip provided a solid purchase for the firing hand. The buttstock length, designed for men wearing heavy clothing or equipment, allowed for quick mounting from various positions. British soldiers often remarked that the Lee-Enfield felt like a natural extension of the body once they became accustomed to it. Maintenance requirements for the Lee-Enfield were minimal compared to many other military rifles. The basic cleaning kit, consisting of a pull-through cord stored in the buttstock, a small bottle of oil, and a cleaning rag, was sufficient for field maintenance. British soldiers were taught to clean their rifles daily when possible, pulling an oiled cloth through the barrel to remove fouling, wiping down the bolt face and breech, and applying a thin coat of oil to all metal surfaces. This simple routine, taking perhaps 5 minutes, was enough to keep the rifle functioning reliably. More thorough cleaning, involving disassembly of the bolt and magazine, was recommended monthly, but wasn't critical to continued function. The rifle's tolerance for neglect was remarkable. British weapons examiners after World War I tested rifles that had been in continuous combat service for years, often with minimal maintenance. Many rifles with thousands of rounds fired that had been exposed to mud, rain, and harsh conditions still functioned reliably and remained reasonably accurate. The generous tolerances and simple mechanism meant wear didn't significantly affect function until round counts exceeded 10,000 to 15,000 rounds, far beyond what most combat rifles experienced. Barrels remained adequate for military accuracy even after extensive use. The development of the .303 British cartridge deserves attention in understanding the Lee-Enfield's effectiveness. Introduced in 1888 with the adoption of the Lee-Metford rifle, the .303 British was one of the first small-bore smokeless powder military cartridges. The original load used compressed black powder and a round-nosed bullet. In 1891, cordite propellant replaced black powder, giving the .303 British its distinctive power and burning characteristics. The Mark VII Spitzer bullet, introduced in 1910, improved long-range performance significantly. This bullet, with its flat base and sharp point, offered better ballistics than earlier rounds while maintaining good terminal performance. The rimmed case design of the .303 British, inherited from earlier black powder cartridges, was considered obsolete by the early 20th century. Most nations had adopted rimless designs that fed more reliably from magazines and simplified extraction. The British retained the rimmed case partly due to the enormous investment in rifles, ammunition, and production equipment, but also because the Lee-Enfield's magazine system worked well with rimmed cartridges. The magazine's unique design, with a zigzag follower that offset cartridges slightly, prevented rim-over-rim jams that plagued some other rifles using rimmed cartridges. The ballistic performance of the .303 British was entirely adequate for military purposes. The Mark VII load pushed a 174-grain bullet to approximately 2,140 feet per second from the rifle's 25-inch barrel, generating about 2,400 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. This was less than the German 7.92 Somkr 57 or American 30.06, but enough to remain effective at ranges where infantry combat actually occurred. The moderate recoil, about 12 to 14 foot-pounds with standard loads, was manageable, allowing for faster recovery between shots than more powerful cartridges. The terminal performance of the .303 British was controversial. The Mark VII bullet was designed to be unstable in tissue, tumbling shortly after impact and creating larger wound channels than its diameter suggested. This was achieved through an aluminum or wood tip that moved the bullet's centre of gravity rearward. The design was effective but raised questions about compliance with Hague Convention, restrictions on expanding bullets. British authorities maintained the bullet wasn't technically expanding and therefore was legal. Regardless of legalities, the Mark VII was effective against personnel, and that's what mattered to soldiers using it. The industrial capacity required to keep British and Commonwealth forces supplied with .303 British ammunition during both World Wars was staggering. During World War I, British ammunition production exceeded 5 billion rounds. During World War II, production approached 7 billion rounds. This ammunition was manufactured at arsenals across Britain, Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa. The quality control systems ensured that ammunition produced in different facilities on different continents could be used interchangeably. Cartridges head-stamped in Calcutta functioned perfectly in rifles used in Burma or Europe. The logistical advantages of having a single rifle caliber across the entire British Empire simplified supply considerably. British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, South African, and colonial forces all used the same ammunition, allowing for pooling of supplies and transfer of stocks as needed. This contrasted with the Germans in World War II, who had multiple rifle calibers in service, complicating logistics. The Italians, fighting alongside the Germans, used still different calibers, creating nightmare scenarios where ammunition captured from one ally couldn't be used by the other. The post-war career of the Lee-Enfield in Commonwealth military service continued for decades after Britain retired the rifle. Canada used the number 4 as its standard service rifle until 1955 and continued issuing it to reserve forces into the 1960s. Australia didn't fully replace the Lee-Enfield until the adoption of the L1A1 in the mid-1960s, and some ceremonial and training rifles remained in service even longer. New Zealand similarly used Lee-Enfields as frontline weapons until the 1960s. India manufactured and used Lee-Enfields, eventually rechambered to 7.60 mm NATO into the 1980s. This extended service life meant that Lee-Enfield saw combat in conflicts well beyond World War II. British forces used them during the Malayan Emergency from 1948 to 1960, where jungle fighting conditions similar to Burma proved the rifle's continued relevance. Australian troops carried Lee-Enfields during the early years of the Vietnam War, before transitioning to the L1A1. Indian and Pakistani forces used Lee-Enfields during their multiple wars. The rifle appeared in virtually every post-colonial conflict across Africa and Asia, sometimes in the hands of government forces, sometimes carried by insurgents or guerrillas. The rifle's appearance in irregular warfare into the 21st century reflects both its availability and its suitability for conflicts where ammunition is scarce, maintenance facilities are limited, and reliability matters more than sophisticated features. Taliban fighters in Afghanistan were still using Lee-Enfields in the 2000s, rifles that in some cases had been in service for 70 or 80 years. These rifles, maintained with improvised parts and minimal tools, continued functioning, testament to the robustness of the design. The collecting community's fascination with Lee-Enfields has helped preserve thousands of rifles that might otherwise have been destroyed. Military surplus Lee-Enfields have been available on civilian markets since the 1920s, with major influxes after both World Wars and again as various nations modernized their militaries in the 1960s through 1980s. These rifles, often available for modest prices, became starting points for collectors interested in military history. The variety of marks, manufacturers, and dates meant that assembling a comprehensive Lee-Enfield collection could be a lifetime pursuit. The Lee-Enfield's impact on popular culture, while less pronounced than some other military rifles, is nonetheless significant. The rifle appears in countless films, books, and video games set during the World Wars or colonial era. For audiences in Britain and the Commonwealth, the Lee-Enfield carries cultural resonance beyond its function as a weapon. It represents historical periods, military traditions, and national experiences. The image of a British Tommy with his Lee-Enfield has become iconic, representing British participation in the World Wars in the same way that images of American GIs with M1 Garands represent American participation. Looking at the Lee-Enfield's century-long service life and its impact on military history, several conclusions emerge. First, the rifle demonstrated that design compromises made to optimize combat effectiveness could be more valuable than theoretical perfection. The rear-locking bolt, criticized by target shooters for introducing flex, enabled the rapid fire that saved lives in combat. Second, the rifle proved that comprehensive training can transform a weapon's effectiveness. The Lee-Enfield in untrained hands was a decent bolt-action rifle. In trained hands, it became a rapid-fire devastation machine. Third, the rifle showed that reliability and simplicity often matter more than sophistication. The Lee-Enfield's simple design and robust construction meant it continued working in conditions that disabled more refined weapons. The legacy of the Lee-Enfield extends beyond the rifle itself to the doctrinal lessons it validated. The British emphasis on rapid fire, controversial when first adopted, proved correct for the conditions of 20th century warfare. Modern military small arms doctrine still emphasises volume of fire, though now delivered by select-fire weapons rather than bolt-action rifles. The principle that overwhelming an enemy with firepower is often more effective than relying solely on precision remains valid. The Lee-Enfield era demonstrated this principle with a weapon that required manual operation between each shot. Modern assault rifles carrying out the same principle with automatic fire are evolutionary descendants of the rapid-fire doctrine the Lee-Enfield validated. When the last Lee-Enfields were retired from British service in 1957, they were 55 years removed from the original SMLE adopted in 1902. Few weapons in military history have remained relevant for so long. Fewer still have influenced military thinking as profoundly as the Lee-Enfield did through its validation of rapid-fire tactics. The rifle that German soldiers in August 1914 mistook for machine guns, that stunned advancing infantry with its speed and volume of fire that served through 2 world wars and dozens of smaller conflicts, stands as one of the most successful military rifle designs ever created. Not because it was perfect, but because it was exactly what was needed, when it was needed, and it worked reliably for generations. The thunder of massed Lee-Enfield fire at Mons announced the arrival of modern infantry firepower. That thunder echoed through a century of conflict and remains part of military heritage today.